Well, happy noon, everybody. Welcome to the Aquinas Lecture Series. Today, our speaker is Gary Robertson from the Economics Department, and he's going to be talking about Keynesian versus supply-side economics. Please help me welcome Gary with a round of applause.
See, there is a part of my biography that probably none of you know. I taught at Aquinas from '69 until May of '73, when I resigned and went back to graduate school at the University of Toronto. One of my senior students had brought me the catalog from the University of Toronto, thinking of attending himself. And he said, "What do you think of it?" And I read over the program, and it was exactly, I thought, what I was looking for. Toronto today probably still has a Department of Political Economy, which is what I was keenly interested in. In the Christmas break of '72, '73, the American Economic Association held their conference in Toronto, and I attended that and interviewed the University of Toronto's economics department. They were under the impression that they were interviewing me, but I was actually interviewing them. But it turned out that I forgot to ask the most important question of all: are you Keynesian? 95%, maybe higher, of graduate programs in North America would be Keynesian, so I just assumed that it was. In my first year of courses, they did, first of all, microeconomics, which won't be much different between Keynesian and monetarist or supply-side economics. But in the second semester, I was in a study group, a question was raised, an answer was given, and in my usual tactful manner, I asked, "What the hell kind of an answer is that?" Now, given that my age is about 28 maybe at that time, and they tend to be around 22, I'm dealing with younger colleagues at the time. I'm very well educated in the Canadian system in economics. And they said, "It's a monetarist answer." And I said, "Why a monetarist answer?" And they all looked at me and they said, "You don't know." And the truth was, I didn't know that I had joined a monetarist program, the opposite of Keynesian economics, the arch enemy of Keynesian economics. And I was confronted with a choice: do I just trash that year, tell my wife, who after 2 weeks in Canada bore our second child under difficult circumstances, and say, "Well, honey, you know, we got to just forget this year and move to another town and start all over," or do I remain in the program? And I decided that strategically it would be easier to pass comprehensives as a monetarist than it is as a Keynesian, and so stayed in the program and passed their comprehensives. So I'm a unique economist. I have been trained in both Keynesian economics and monetarist economics, and I frequently advertise myself as a schizophrenic economist. Now, the topic today is Keynesian versus supply side. Supply side is just one of the labels that's applied to monetarist economics. And I think this is the economics that lies behind the two presidential candidates, where Obama, if you can categorize him, would be a Keynesian, and Romney, again, if you can figure out where on earth he's located, say he would be on the supply side of economics. For Keynesians, obviously, it starts with John Maynard Keynes, who was a brilliant economist from a brilliant family. Current economists are Paul Krugman and Joseph Stiglitz, each of whom have won Nobel Prizes. On the monetarist supply side, you have Milton Friedman, who resuscitated monetary economics. The economics that dominated Western civilization's thinking into the Great Depression was monetary economics. It was an utter failure at trying to explain what happened during the Great Depression, let alone make recommendations as to how to improve the situation. And a prominent current practitioner would be Arthur Laffer. He has a famous curve that I will show you later, known as the Laffer curve, that tries to make a point, but I think fails quite miserably. Distinguishing between the two, Keynesian, the key concept determining unemployment will be aggregate demand. And in terms of notation that we frequently use, it's the second line down. AD, aggregate demand, is equal to the sum of consumer spending The I stands for business spending. G is government, and in parentheses you have the foreign sector, exports and imports. We're presuming entirely that it's newly produced goods and services, whichever category it happens to be in, and so it's total spending that determines the level of employment in the economy from the Keynesian perspective, and that was a brand new approach when Keynes developed it. On the other side of the issue, the monetarist would contend that it's simply the money supply and their explanation, M for money, V, which is the velocity of money, that's a product, I couldn't get a dot in between them, equals P, the price level, times Q, the level of output produced. And Keynesians agree that that particular equation, MV equals PQ, is true. We just find it uninteresting. If you produce 14 trillion, just to cite a number, of GDP, total output of the economy in a year's time, it has to be true that the amount of money times the rate at which it changes hands, which is the velocity of money, has to equal the product of the prices times the stuff that was produced. It's just a tautology. But again, in Keynesian economics, while we find money important, we find that equation uninteresting, I guess would be the proper word. So, policy proposals. If you're dealing with high unemployment, which is what we have today, we had the worst recession since the Great Depression when Obama walked into office. The talking heads refer to it as the economy about to fall off a cliff. We were losing 700 to 800,000 jobs per month when Obama took office. And from a Keynesian perspective, the way that you solve the problem is to increase aggregate demand. In circumstances like that, consumers aren't spending because they've lost their incomes, because they've lost their jobs. And that's not everybody, but the rest of them who have retained jobs are highly anxious about retaining their jobs, and so they tighten their belts and decrease their spending, preparing for a potential rainy day. Businesses won't be building new facilities and adding new equipment because their sales are down and there isn't any incentive to do it. The foreign sector typically is no salvation because when we're down, they're down as well, so you can't increase exports. And you're left then actually with item number 3 on the list. In normal circumstances, if it's just a routine recession, what you want to do is increase aggregate demand. You could do it by, first of all, decreasing taxes to stimulate consumer spending. Secondly, decrease business taxes. The intent is to increase business spending that we call investment. Then item number 3, straight off, increase government spending. There's a fourth option, and that's the money supply. You could increase the money supply trying to stimulate spending by all of the various components. That's the Keynesian approach. The monetarist approach, exemplified by those initials CGRR, that stands for constant growth rate rule. Friedman's argument is the economy historically has grown at a rate of 3 to 4% per year. You obviously need to increase the money supply at the same rate in order to allow it, the increased output, to be purchased. So increase the money supply at a stable rate between 3 and 4% per year. He had proposed, Friedman is now deceased, he had proposed that you should abolish the Federal Reserve and just set up a mechanism whereby the money supply would increase at that constant rate. So their proposal amounts to do nothing when the economy is in a recession. There's also, on their side of the fence, the Laffer curve, where they argue that tax rates are too high, and if only you would decrease tax rates, then business activity would increase, and as a consequence, tax revenue would also increase, and so you wouldn't confront an increased deficit. Roger? Yes, go ahead. Well, I look at it and say the after effect. If you didn't have a Federal Reserve, then nothing is occurring, as opposed to activist monetary policy, which the Fed currently engages in. To fight inflation, they decrease the rate of growth of the money supply, which drives up interest rates. To fight recession, they increase the rate of growth in order to reduce interest rates and stimulate spending once again. Yes? Yeah, I'm not a tremendous fan of Hayek. See, I teach a course called Capitalism and Socialism that utilizes a PBS series that contrasted Keynes and Hayek. And at the last American Economic Association convention in this past January, I ran across a newly published book, Keynes and Hayek, that I now use in that course. I'm quite familiar with his work. But he's certainly on the monetarist side. And he's part of the Austrian school. Clearly, he was born an Austrian. And they always looked at money and interest rates and then had very complex, and I consider horribly erroneous arguments for trying to explain why you should just leave everything to the free market. But Hayek would be on that side. And his mentor was Ludwig von Mises. And Joseph Schumpeter belongs in the same group. The Great Depression was the crucial economic phenomenon that creates a great intellectual divide between Keynesians and monetarists. On the Keynesian side, the argument is that aggregate demand decreased. Decreased, in parentheses, it fell off a cliff. That causes investment to fall, which creates unemployment. That causes, in turn, a drop in income. The drop in income causes consumers to decrease their spending, and it likewise causes a decrease in tax revenue collected because the base, the income level, has shrunk. And then the government's budget position, even if they were trying to balance it, would automatically fall into deficit. In the 1930s, at the onset of the Great Depression, a deficit by the federal government was the worst thing imaginable. And so their response, the politicians' response, would be to either decrease spending and or increase taxes. They increased taxes by 52% on average, and when the smoke clears because they've taken more money out of consumers' pockets, their spending had decreased further, and they still had a deficit and quite possibly larger than what they initially had to deal with. I mean, that's the fourth line down there. Along with it, of course, you've heard about the bank failures. I believe it was about 1/3 of the banks in this country failed. You didn't have an FDIC at that time. So whatever savings you had in a failed bank simply evaporated with little to no understanding of where on earth the money went. And so people who may have been solvent running businesses or operating farms could find themselves with no funds to maintain those operations and lose farm, business, savings, and get horribly annoyed and begin to believe that this system in the United States, capitalism coupled with democracy, maybe is a total failure. During the decade of the 1930s, if you know the history, we made quasi-heroes out of bank robbers and murderers, John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, Babyface Nelson, on and on it goes. On the monetarist side, the cause of the Great Depression, they would contend that a decrease in money causes an increase in interest rates. The increase in the interest rate causes a drop in spending, and then the drop in spending leads to a downward cycle. Now that is certainly a possibility. Keynesian economists would argue under some circumstances that could have caused a downturn in the economy. It's not the argument that we make these days for that particular time. The PowerPoint slide that I had didn't come out bright enough or in great enough contrast, and so I have this from my email account. If you can read the headings, what you're looking at in column number 1, after the column with the years in question, it reads money supply. To an economist, it's the second column that's more important. Real money supply, meaning taking into account the amount of money relative to the price level. And the contention of the monetarist is that the money supply decreased because of wrong-headed Federal Reserve policy. That led to interest rate increases in the sequence of events that I had just shown you. But if you read down column 2, 26.0, 26.1, 26.7, the money supply in real terms has increased through 1931, and the depression is already underway. It's only after that that the real money supply begins to decrease. And you could attribute that to the bank failures. Obviously, when banks are failing and money is evaporating, the money supply will now decrease. Column number 4 is the column that Keynesian economists pay attention to. That is real fixed investment, meaning that businesses are building facilities and buying long-lived equipment. Real means we've taken price level changes out of the data. That's all that it means. It's done statistically. And so you can see the numbers: 14.9, 11.4, 8.0, 4.5, 3.9 consecutively. There is a decrease from start to finish of that sequence that I gave you of 74%. Investment spending by businesses collapsed by 74%, and that sets in motion the sequence of events that I detailed on the Keynesian side of the argument. That's the Laffer curve. And the argument is that there is some tax rate at which the federal government would maximize its tax revenue. With that curve, it occurs at point C. The question that needs to be defined even to this day, because this has been around for 30 or more years by now, is what is the tax rate that pertains to C, point C. That diagram is totally arbitrary. There isn't any statistical analysis to say that that's where the tax rate would be. We didn't have an average tax rate back in the late 1970s or the 80s that would exceed 60%. If the tax rate that prevailed at the time happened to be at point D, then in cutting taxes, you would move to point C and collect more revenue than you had previously, because on the vertical axis, we're measuring how much revenue the government collects. And the idea behind supply-side tax cuts was exactly that. Taxes are too high. Cut taxes. It'll stimulate business activity. It'll generate income, and it will increase taxes collected by the government. If, however, you were at point B and you cut taxes, then you're going to move down that curve towards point A, and the revenue collected will decrease. I have buried in my office someplace an article from the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal in May of 1984, when Reagan is up for re-election, which says, contrary to what was expected, the Reagan tax cuts caused the deficit to rise, and the number at that time, minuscule today, was 44 billion. But it demonstrated that they were quite wrong about the Laffer curve. Okay, this one I've already mentioned, and that is the end of my slideshow presentation. From what I hear,